Oh, well, good afternoon, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Negotiating Your Success. Do your suppliers finally have a voice? And I think it's a really exciting and timely topic, given the discussions that we've been having just generally in the industry and also at here at HICS. Before we sort of jump into the main content, just to let you know, we've got a slight change to the lineup of panelists. So unfortunately, due to some technical issues, John Hansen hasn't been able to join this call. He may join us slightly later on. We will continue to try and reconnect with John and see what we can do there. So look out for that. We'll welcome John when he joins. But otherwise, in a moment, I will sort of hand over and go through the panelists to introduce themselves, and we will introduce the topic. Before we do that, just a couple of points to note about the event. So the webinar is being recorded, first of all, and will be available for review after the live session today. You've probably seen it, but there's a comments box on your screen. So please do feel free to share your thoughts or questions with us as we explore the topic. And we would be glad to hear from you throughout and address those points. And then last thing before I sort of hand over to the panelists is I just wanted to explain very briefly the context behind the webinar today. Now, as many of you know, there has been a real drive towards exploring this idea of the supplier experience when working with organizations and enterprises. There's a desire on the enterprise side to understand the supplier's perspective and what that looks like for suppliers working with organizations. So as part of that, we've also recently completed our own survey on the topic, which is the Voice of the Supplier Survey. So for this report, we asked over 500 suppliers, in fact, for their views on what they think it's really like to serve their most important enterprise customers. By those, we mean those with billion-dollar revenues or more. We asked them for input on things like what they would like to see as part of a great supplier experience and the ways in which they would like to see collaboration between supplier and organizations strengthened. And specifically, we focused on the friction points when dealing with enterprise customers, what was causing those and how they believed interactions could be improved. Now, we'll touch on some of those points during the discussion today. The full report will be due out on the 6th of September, so do stay posted for that. Again, we'd love to hear your thoughts on those findings when we publish them. So at the end of the live session today, you will be directed to some initial materials that we have and also pointed to some ways in which to interact with us and follow the conversation as it develops. However, I don't want to delay us any further in terms of jumping into the main event. So what we'll do at this point, I'll start with Peter and sort of work around the room on my screen. But Peter, if you could just first of all introduce yourself, your background, and some of the things you're working on at the moment.
Hi, yes, I'm Peter Smith. I've been in procurement since about 1876, I think it was. Started as a buyer of raw materials, then a procurement director, CPO in 3 large organizations, 1 public sector, government, and 2 private sector. Did consulting for quite a few years, a lot with the UK government, ran the Spend Matters website in Europe for 8 years, and decided I wanted to stop writing articles and write some books. You might see them on the shelf behind me. So the most recent one being, get the plug in, Procurement with Purpose. So all about sustainable procurement, ESG. It's not for profit, so I'm allowed to plug it a bit. And how procurement is making a contribution to the big agendas around the environment, social factors, economic factors, and so on. So we might come back and touch on some of those. I still do a bit of consultancy. I've been interested in sort of buyer-supplier dynamics for many years. I think I introduced the first almost totally unsuccessful supplier relationship management program into the UK public sector 25 years ago. It didn't work at all, but I was trying, you know. So yes, been interested in topics around buyers and suppliers for many years. I live just out of London in the UK.
Fantastic. And Corinne, just turning to you, because obviously this is an interesting topic from your perspective, given that you work with suppliers. So it'd be great to hear a little bit more about your work and your interest around this specific topic.
Well, great. Thank you for having me, first of all. My name is Corinne Pohlmann. I am the Senior Vice President for National Affairs and Partnerships for an organization called the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. So I bring that side of the pond. And what we do is we represent 95,000 small and medium-sized businesses across Canada who are all independently owned Canadian companies, most of whom do some supplying to larger companies. And certainly it's an area we always continue to monitor closely, either with government procurement or obviously increasingly, actually, I would say on the private sector side as well. We certainly, because we're so focused on small and medium-sized enterprises, we represent sort of their interests. We certainly sort of have gotten involved in a number of scenarios in which smaller companies have had some difficulties interacting or dealing with larger suppliers. And a couple examples that come to mind quickly, for example, in this country, in Canada, is the on the grocery supply chain. For example, there's been a lot of consolidation in the grocery industry in Canada. I think that's not uncommon in other places in the world. And the suppliers are mostly small and are finding themselves become sort of priced takers. They have to sort of go with whatever is being told that they have to do. And that's one thing, but beyond that, sometimes the rules change in the middle of a contract. And so is that fair? And so we've been working closely to try to figure out ways to do, I don't know what some other countries have already done, like a grocery code of conduct, that kind of idea that's not in place yet in Canada, but I know it's in place in many other jurisdictions in the world. And certainly looking at other ways that we can sort of level the playing field to make sure that suppliers understand what the rules are and that there is a bit of accountability on the part of suppliers as well, or sorry, on the account of the industry as well.
Fantastic. And Ragnar, finally to you.
Yeah, no, good. I'm Ragnar Laurenson. My day job is Chief Commercial Officer at Hicks. Don't worry, I'm not going to try and promote and sell and convince you anything about what we are doing here today. I have been invited to the panel. Thank you, Duncan, for that. More in my capacity as chair of a supplier experience community, which we have started to develop since last year. And this group essentially comes together to share, learn, and interact on how we can put more focus and emphasis on suppliers in our procurement and digital transformations. So around 30 large enterprises, 70, 80 participants are joining this group now, and we're doing case studies. We are having external speakers, and we're trying to drive forward a common agenda around supplier experience management. Now, my background is with procurement leaders. So I had the fortune of building out part of that organization with Peter's co-author on his latest book, Mark Pereira, for about a decade. I have much more of a macro view on things. We've been tracking maturity development in procurement, and I am very passionate about how this function is evolving and the changing dynamics of it. And I, for one, do believe that suppliers will play a more important role than it's done in the past. And I probably also think we're starting to see a bit of a rebalancing in the supplier-buyer power dynamic as well.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for kicking us off there. So what we'll do today is a fairly open session, a fairly open discussion. So what I'll do to get you started off is, I guess, just introduce the topic for today. So we're going to be looking at this changing nature of buyer-supplier relationships kind of generally. So if any of you want to sort of start off, I guess, with your thoughts on that fairly broad topic. Peter, you look like you're sort of ready to jump in on that.
Well, let me sort of take the lead in the absence of John. I mean, it seems to me that there's often a big disconnect between what CPOs and senior procurement people believe their suppliers think of them and their organization, and what those suppliers really think about them. And I'm interested, Corinne, I guess you get the unvarnished truth from your suppliers, and bearing in mind that, as you say, they tend to be the small and medium firms. What do they, I don't know, over a cup of coffee or a beer, what do they tell you? What do they really think of their big customers and how the procurement people treat them?
Yeah, I think, often what we hear, I'll start by saying we don't always get the good stories. We often get the not so good stories. So I don't want to come into this and paint everybody with the same brush, because I don't think that's fair. However, we increasingly do hear about circumstances where smaller businesses feel that it's an unlevel playing field. And what many of them really just want is they really just want to understand what the rules are and that everybody's going to abide by the rules, and that when they sign a contract or a deal or an agreement with a buyer, that's going to be abided by. And I think increasingly we've been hearing about some of these circumstances where that's not always been the case. And when that happens, there's also very little, many of them often feel there's very little way that they can actually contest it or try to appeal what's happened. When they try to potentially go to the buyer to find out, why was this particular fine imposed, or why did you change the circumstances of this particular situation? They don't always get answers. They often have to go back and repeat it. There's no sort of way to appeal. There's no other sort of body looking at it. It's sort of what the buyer says goes, and they sort of have to live with the circumstances of the situation. So I think that's why I think for a lot of them, they just want to have a clear understanding of what the rules are, and that there is some accountability there to make sure that they're both abiding by those rules. Right now, it feels quite one-sided for many of them. And I think that's sort of the situation for some. Again, we only hear the bad stories, not the good stories. So but that is certainly what we hear, actually increasingly more, I think, in the private sector, even than with government.
Interesting. I mean, you're talking about some sort of basic legal and ethical issues there, because I mean, it is, if not illegal, certainly unethical, I would say, to break a contract. And some of the things I've heard about in retail about, demanding extra discounts and rebates and so on, which shouldn't happen. I know the UK's grocery regulator. I worked with her at Mars Confectionery many years ago. If she's still there, I haven't checked, but pristine taper. But does it all come down to power? Because I remember, well, he's still around. He's retired. There's a guy called Professor Andrew Cox, who was very active in the procurement world maybe 20 years ago, at his peak probably at Birmingham University. And he wrote some great books. They're not the easiest reading, but his thinking about power in the supply chain, I found really illuminating in probably the early days of my procurement director life. And he's got quite it's not a cynical view. I think it's a very realistic view that says most relationships are defined by where the power lies, and that actually procurement strategies should be based on the power dynamics. So for instance, actually, if you have a situation where a supplier holds more power than you, as a buyer, that's a good time to try and develop collaboration and all the rest of it. I mean, obviously you want something out of it, but it's also a defensive move because you don't hold the power. And if you do hold the power, then frankly, you can play hardball with your suppliers. So I think an awful lot of this does come down to power, unfortunately. And smaller suppliers, if they can't find a way of developing some power themselves, they're in a difficult situation, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's the crux of it, right? It's is there a way that they can have a bit of that power in order to sort of be able to balance that situation, so that they can push back and say, I'm not going to sell it to you anymore. I'm going to sell it to your competitor. The problem is there's not always a lot of other competitors out there, and they become sort of dependent on a particular buyer. And that's where I think the danger lies, right? So it's more than just the supplier-buyer dynamic. And I agree, can be that power relationship, and that's always going to be there. It's just a matter of making sure that the rules are clear. And I don't think even suppliers mind that too much, or potentially buyers if the supplier is more powerful. It's just making sure that the rules, the basic rules and foundation of that relationship are clear.
I think that's a good point. Ragnar, you mentioned you thought maybe some of the power dynamics are changing at the moment. I suspect I know where you're coming from on that, but do you want to expand on that, and I'll chip in as well?
Well, I do agree with you, Peter. I do believe hardcore economic dynamics will remain as the basis to determine the power, and hence then how that relationship outcome unfolds. I often talk a story to new starters, both in procurement leaders and in HICS, by the way, where I very simplistically outline 4 imperatives of our procurement function, which is extremely simplistic, but you have a phase where there were no supply markets. Most companies were vertically integrated, before 1970s perhaps. Then you had Peter Drucker and, Michael Porter coming in with, how do you become competitive? How do you pursue excellence? How do you find your specialization? And to me, this was a big driver to create supply markets. the dynamic in that phase, let's say 70s, 80s, were a supplier power dynamic, because these supply markets weren't very developed. They had very big suppliers in them, and the capability on the buyer side were pretty small in terms of how you manage that. Then last 20 years has been the huge revolution we've seen in procurement, which I see as procurement enterprises grabbing back that power and starting to get costs under control. And now you can probably outline a few scenarios about where things are moving. Is it going to be pure supplier market, again, or is there some balance? I think clearly some of the cost opportunities have been depleted in the last couple of years. So procurement, as they mature, have to find new sources of value. So that scorecard of what does procurement success mean is now broadening. Clearly, there's been a lot of disruption over at least the last couple of years. Whether this is now VUCA is the new normal, or whether we're going to go into more stable markets, who knows? I think most companies are preparing themselves for continued volatility. But when I'm, by the way, reading this book by BCG at the moment, which is a classic book, I think, but it is hitting on levers that I broadly agree. You're looking for cost, obviously. You're looking for innovation, you're looking for risk reduction, you're looking for sustainability, and you're looking for performance in your suppliers. So I think with more of these levers represented to suppliers, I think you can start competing on more than cost. And maybe in the retail space, maybe that's going to take longer. Maybe it's not going to happen at all. It is a cutthroat industry, and no doubt about it. But I'm quite positive around procurement's progress, and because we are seeing company after company launching supplier experience, supplier-driven transformations now, where they're thinking, how do we become customer of choice? How do we make it easier for suppliers to work with us? And they try to institutionalize it in the sense they don't only think about the 1-2 top suppliers anymore, they're thinking about the whole ecosystem. Dan Barton, the CPO Schneider Electric, said it very beautifully. He thinks 75% of the innovation coming into Schneider Electric in the next 5 years is going to be from startups and evolving ecosystem. It's not from their tier 1 suppliers, and it's not going to be internal. So it changes the dynamic. And I really hope that this will also mean we're changing our approach to smaller suppliers.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hi. Okay. I turned off. You know what?
Hi, John.
I have a
Hello,
face
John.
for radio. So once I turn off the camera, it disabled the camera, but put on this. You know what? Listen, let's just pick it up in stream there, everybody. And sorry for joining. It just was impossible to get in for whatever reason. But you're talking about, and Ragnar, you're talking about something that's very interesting to me, because you're saying that the development and the opportunities will come through not the main tier suppliers, but the secondary and third and smaller suppliers. Peter, remember when we talked a little while ago about the upside down Heinz ketchup bottle, your famous story? You remember that? Was that not a supplier? That was a supplier who brought that to Heinz, and they collaborated and worked together, didn't they?
Yeah. They did. I don't think it was a small supplier, to be fair. I think it was an existing quite expert supplier. But yeah, I mean, a lot of companies, as Ragnar says, are thinking that the innovation is going to come from supply markets. But you have to think, and Heinz is a good example, why would your suppliers bring that innovation to you as opposed to another company, or maybe even doing something with it themselves? If they thought it was such a great idea, they could have subcontracted the ketchup manufacturer and launched their own product. So Heinz must have had a good enough relationship with that company, that supplier, that they felt comfortable bringing it to Heinz and thought they would get something out of it.
And I want to get Corinne involved with this, because you mentioned something on the other side of the coin, and you mentioned the grocery industry, and Peter will come back to, and Ragnar, I want to get your take on this. But one of the biggest challenges when we originally talked, Corinne, you're saying that with government procurement, for example, it just wasn't worth the time and the cycles for small, medium enterprises where most innovation occurs to get involved. So they weren't really engaged. And you mentioned the what's happening in the grocery industry, the food industry, and it reminded me of the Walmart classic pickle story. Do you remember that? where Vlasic Pickles had to go bankrupt because Walmart said, we're going to shrink down. You're going to give us the best price on our shelf for a 1 gallon jar that people, would pay for a 500, half the size jar. And what ended up happening is Vlasic had to go under. And I'm not picking on Walmart here, but the reality is for Peter's creativity and that thing with Heinz, if you deal in that predatory market of we want to get the best price and beat inflation or shrinkflation, all these other elements, doesn't that make that more difficult to access that kind of creativity and intelligence?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it creates a distrust and there's no loyalty. I think the ideal situation is that you have this sort of symbiotic relationships where your supplier feel loyal to you and want to work with you, and vice versa, because they can potentially provide, I think, as the Heinz ketchup story, some innovative ways that things can be put on the shelves of a retailer, for example. So yeah, I mean, I think that is a much more conducive way, and a lot more of what we're hearing as we see more consolidation of large companies and large industries is that's not necessarily always happening today. It feels, again, more like you have no choice as a supplier. At least in some of the, again, circumstances we hear about, that they feel like they're boxed in and they have to do it a certain way. And if they don't, they're going to be basically turfed. And because it's such a large supplier and there may not be many other competitors in the marketplace, it becomes.
Well, see, this is interesting. Ragnar, I want to go to you, and then I'll go back to you, Peter. Ragnar, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Humphrey and Schmidt's governance model back from 2002, but they said there's 3 types of governance models with suppliers. There's network, which is implying cooperation between firms of more or less equal power, and they share their competencies within the chain. There's what's known as quasi-hierarchy, involving relationships between legally independent firms, but one is a subordinate to the other. So I look at the network one and say that was the Heinz example. I'd look at what the Vlasic Pickles, and talking with Corinne, said about a quasi-hierarchy is that, yes, they're legally independent, but they're certainly one that is the dominant rule maker. And then there's hierarchy when a firm is owned by an external firm outright. So when you look at those kinds of framework and look at those 2 types of scenario, I mean, how do you approach that? How do you create a solution that moves anything into a more cooperative environment, regardless of company size?
Well, I think this is what a lot of companies are trying to prepare for now, by the way. And if you look at the leaders in the field, those that are more mature and aren't the Walmart, I think that there's a big question mark whether Walmart will just continue doing what they're doing because of the nature of that industry. But the world is moving into more of a network-based type of model. It's assuming that the pivotal point here is not between a buyer and a supplier. People are thinking value chain. They're part of a value chain who's going to build the capability to drive value for an end customer. And that end customer is driven by, they buy because of, probably still Michael Porter type of reasons: better quality, better cost, more innovation, and these types of things. So companies are thinking we need to build a value chain and orchestrate an ecosystem where the whole ecosystem is starting to collaborate. And where a lot of companies now, as I mentioned, is thinking that innovation, that collaboration is not going to just be with your tier 1. It's going to be with a big subset of organizations. And increasingly the innovation is assumed to be coming from smaller organizations. So but of course you're going to still have, relationships maybe where there's more hierarchy, where you can dictate more. Certain industries like automotives, for instance, will potentially be a bit more inclined to that. How technology is disrupting that could potentially have an impact. But overall, I think companies are moving into more of a network-based model. Now, how do you do that? I don't think we need to talk too much about that. But this is obviously what we are trying to facilitate here in HICS, and a lot of other best of breed vendors, a lot of other tech vendors, a lot of companies are trying to figure out how do you architect for a better supplier experience. I love this example around, we don't take our customers for granted. We don't take our employees for granted. Anyone who would do that, they would be back in the 60s, 70s. they are fighting for the best talent. They're fighting for the best customer, and they are nurturing them and trying to optimize the experience so that they want to, to be a customer of you. And that, I think, is coming gradually with our fourth enterprise stakeholder, the supplier. And we believe things will probably starting to be replicated by how we do customer marketing. Supplier marketing will probably become a topic of the future, where you start to position yourself around, hey, look at how great we are. Look at the great service we have. Look at the customer of, the feedback score we have from our suppliers. Look at our innovation programs, and really start to pick up.
Well, what's interesting, and you mentioned the auto industry, and I remember a study that was done a number of years ago, where they're talking about how some of the manufacturers were very slow to pay their supply base, and the ones who paid the suppliers faster had a higher level of satisfaction. Ultimately, the study found that they produced a better quality product by having contented suppliers, because suppliers can only deal with so many things. Here's the thing, we look at the Heinz ketchup example. Peter, I'll come back to you and go around the table again. We look at the Heinz ketchup example. What were the triggers for that collaboration? And it reminded me of what happened with the I-35 West, and then what's happening with the light rail transit. And Peter, when the bridge collapsed in Minneapolis and St. Paul, people lost their lives. The procurement process abandoned their normal standard approach, worked on an open book framework, and then collaborated to build the bridge. Not only within the 18-month time they had to restore the infrastructure and, of course, honor those who had passed, but on budget. The very next project, which wasn't triggered by a crisis, they went back and reverted to the old way of doing business, and that bridge ran over time and way over budget. And so I'm thinking here, and then you look at the Corinne. I want to introduce this in there. What's happening with the light rail transit PPP system and the breakdown there? We all know about melting wheels, etc. We cover it. So the question I have is this, starting with you, Peter: do we need a crisis to create that kind of collaborative willingness to work together? And is it sustainable beyond? And our crisis right now, obviously, was the COVID-19, the pandemic. It's created awareness. Is this going to cause a permanent shift in direction and thinking towards that collaborative effort that I just talked about with the bridge and what we're seeing now? Yes, Peter.
Are you asking me? There's probably some things we can learn from it, but I mean, if I look at the UK example, we had a couple of successes. I mean, the vaccine program, generally the UK was seen as doing a good job through some interesting collaborative approaches to procurement, which of course are now being built up. That's because we left the rest of Europe so we could do our own thing, which is not true actually. But on the other hand, the procurement of PPE, personal protective equipment, and testing kits and a few other things turned out to be an absolute disaster and has cost the British taxpayer billions and billions and billions, and there's been fraud and corruption and goodness knows what. So I don't know, about emergencies can bring out the best or the worst in people, I think one fundamental issue that perhaps we haven't touched on is I do think collaboration and driving for innovation from suppliers is time consuming and therefore expensive and quite difficult, and you can't do it with all your suppliers. So what I was just musing on with what Ragnar said is, it is possible that you'll get innovation from second tier or smaller suppliers that you didn't think were going to come up with the new Heinz bottle, but have something interesting for you. But you can't be working at the same level with everybody. You're going to have you must identify the suppliers you think are most likely to bring you innovation and success and so on. And put more effort into them. But I think what we might be coming to, from what both Corinne and Ragnar said, is, but you need to treat the rest of your suppliers at least in a way that is ethical, that is as seamless as possible for them, that doing business with you is not a huge pain in the backside. And if you can do all that, at least if you can keep a stance where you're sort of doing better than most of your competitors in terms of dealing with suppliers, even if your touch points are relatively infrequent and so on, if they do come up with something, at least you're in a better position that they'll come to you. But you can't run full collaborative innovation programs with 10,000 suppliers, which is what a big company
the quality
will
of the
have,
relationships are key, and that's
So,
an interesting point. Corinne, I want to go to you and give you an idea of this. In terms of the relationship and who drives it and how it's driven. I was talking with a senior executive from Facebook's diversity program, and when the pandemic hit, a lot of companies reverted into, we got to preserve cash flow and we have to ask for extended terms. Facebook example, and others followed their route to a degree, said, no, we're going to pay you in one day. We're going to pay you sooner because we've got to keep our small, medium enterprise, our diverse supply base, which is a key part of that creative ability, financially strong, and making extended supply chains will only put pressure on it. Not only did they pay early, but they, as a company, went to the suppliers and said, okay, whoever owes you money, other customers of yours, we will front you that money. And when you collect it, you'll pay us back. Now, when you hear something like that, and the thoughts of organizations of going beyond the traditional model, when you hear that, I mean, does that lay, and you have 95,000 members and small and medium enterprises, does that really resonate with small businesses? Does that really resonate with medium enterprises, where I think we can all agree a lot of the original design and creativity comes from? I mean, would that make a difference?
Oh, absolutely. Cash flow is king, right? When you're a small company. And if there is a buyer that you're supplying that's willing to sort of, one, pay you on time, which, as you pointed out, was somebody pointed out in this conversation, was a huge issue during some of the auto crisis in the past. Often it was the large suppliers who would not pay their bills, and it sort of trickled down, so everybody was struggling. So if you pay on time, and on top of that, you're offering to help out in other ways, that can be gold. And during the pandemic, so many smaller companies had to shut down. They just didn't have the cash flow, and having a buyer who's willing to not only pay you, but also help you deal with your other costs is going to be absolutely huge. And so, yes, I think that's the kind of thing that you're going to then see that particular supplier become very loyal and very eager to do what they can to obviously help out.
Okay, so now I'm going to go to you, Ragnar, on this, because this is an interesting point here. And Peter mentioned, you know, most companies have 10,000 suppliers. They can't really manage that necessarily effectively or properly. I mean, you know, in the old days, the answer was, let's rationalize our supply base and get volume pricing. That only found out down the road afterwards that what they did is they literally took them out of the opportunities of a broader supply base. However, how do you better manage that 10,000 suppliers to be able to get the kind of relationship and the kind of insight you need to deliver not only to the traditional metrics of procurement, but the new ESG metrics, the new governance, things like that? How do you do that, Ragnar?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big conversation, of course. But you know, the 10,000-foot view we would take, at least, is one, start treating your entire supply base as an asset. You need to differentiate. You need to segment. The segmentation model needs to change, by the way. So there's different ways you need to think about segmentation now because of what we talked about. Innovation may come from other sources than just your top one, but get a control of that asset, which is often a data challenge first and foremost. Same happened on customer management, by the way. You know, the first level of management, get control of all their information, and then make sure that you are consistent, efficient, and transparent in what I would refer to as more operational type of activities. You know, you pay on time, you provide visibility on payment, you are fair, you're ethical. You know, onboarding is a breeze. You know, it's easy to navigate the tools that you're having. You know, all these types of, you know, seemingly basic, but which is causing huge friction points in the supply relationship today. And to me, this sends the message. You know, are we treated fairly? You know, have we reached the minimum viable standard of, you know, a long-term relationship? The next stage is really then around, well, as we start launch performance programs, ESG programs, sustainability programs, as we start potentially co-innovate with our suppliers, you need to obviously be selective. You need to be open. So, having that openness to collaborate, but then being selective around who you do it. That is a point we haven't really talked about, because as Lance Younger and a lot of, Eloise Epson is talking about, there is 1,000 new platforms now being launched in procurement, who all are, specifically addressing, some of these additional use cases to enhance supplier collaboration or to make procurement more efficient. And that is not a great, experience as well. Louise Epstein is talking about portal fatigue, initiative fatigue. For every new initiative we have suppliers, we ask them for their data. We have to have their data, but we make it really difficult for them to follow suit. Yeah? So that for me is the second level. How do we enable this increased ambition with how we want to deal with suppliers? And then the pivotal, which is where a lot of SRS programs start, is more around this, of innovation and new product development, which you will still only do with the very few. But my argument is, and our argument is, you have to earn the trust to get to that level rather than start to that level and work yourself down. And this kind of shift is what we're seeing. A lot of companies are now kind of.
Well, you see what the trigger was to a
in terms of the
certain
new
degree.
approach to
Is it
supply
safe to
management.
say, Ragnar, and then I'm going to go to you, Peter, with another question, but is it safe to say, Ragnar, that the pandemic and the geopolitical instability we're seeing and the port congestions and all those things, is it safe to say that that's going to be a triggering crisis of where there's now a new understanding or a better understanding, not only the importance of building these relationships, but of maintaining those relationships beyond the crisis point? Do you know what I mean?
No, of course. I mean, we all know the saying, never lose the opportunity of taking advantage of a good crisis. And this is a good crisis in that sense. So many companies have been caught out. They haven't prepared themselves. Starting to do risk management and multi-sourcing, category management. It's too late when the crisis hits. But I do passionately believe that this is what can set us up for the next decade, to do the grunt work to meet some of these challenges of the future. So then, to answer your point, I do believe there is some opportunities to scale and make more sustainable the way we work with suppliers, because it's going to make us more resilient.
And by the way,
future.
Peter, I heard
hope.
You started in procurement in 1876. Was that the year?
Yeah, slight exaggeration, but I've given up saying how many years I've been in the profession, because it is.
Yes, you know what? I share that with you. I'm not 1876, but I might have been 1880. So here's the interesting point of what Ragnar just said, and then Corinne's input upon the positive approach, like let's say a Facebook has taken other companies. Back in 1998, we had cost modeling that was called the Darwinian rivalry model, which is a company negotiates ruthlessly with suppliers. They can provide understanding needed to squeeze the supplier. That's the old way of doing things. The new way they're talking about is cost, value, and impact modeling, where they say they develop in cooperation with suppliers. They improve the quality of the model by capturing supplier insight. Ragnar, something you referred to with regards to needing that data, and jointly develop a model that has a greater probability of being fully applied. Now, that cost value, the better way, was also talked about in 1998. It seems that based upon what we're talking about today is that very same debate, but it's now moving towards actually a cost, value, and impact model. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think a lot of it comes back to power again, and the model, when buyers introduce those sort of models, it's all about trying to get a better deal. Ultimately, it tends to be. I was just thinking way back at the very beginning of my career with Mars Confectionery, one of the exciting spend areas I inherited in my first job in purchasing was dried egg powder. Dried egg powder. Let's call it dried egg powder. And I inherited from my predecessor this very, very detailed cost model of how much we would pay for this egg powder, with a couple of sort of partnership type suppliers, companies we were close to. And it wasn't a huge spend, but it's a critical item, and you want really good quality because it's going into your chocolate bars. And And this was a great complicated cost model with overhead costs and all this. The problem was my predecessor had set up that model because the market price was on the up, and he was trying to control that price and say, well, we don't want to pay £200 a ton. We'll develop a cost model that the supplier will agree is fair, and that gives us a cost of 150 because the market's gone a bit mad at the moment for egg powder. Problem was, by the time I came into it, the market price was 120. It was below our cost model. So then you have the ethical dilemma of saying, well, 150 is a fair price. It's what we have been paying. But now I can buy it from someone else for 120 because that's just where the market is. It doesn't matter what the cost model says. And of course, it's very difficult in that situation for a buyer to say, no, I'll pay an extra 20% because, that's what the cost model says. So I think a lot of those models, great academic theories, but they didn't always stand up to the pressure of day-to-day sort of market conditions and so on. And just a quick UK example more recently, we probably thought that PPE, protective equipment, was down in the leverage box of the Kraljic matrix, and we'd buy big volumes. The National Health Service in the UK, for instance, big volumes, cheap prices, reduced number of suppliers, pile it high and sell it cheap. And that was great until suddenly there was a shortage. And then actually suppliers walked away from their contracts and said, we're not going to supply at that price because the Canadian Health Service or the American health companies are willing to pay 3 times as much. So then we had to pay 5 times as much, and someone else paid 10 times as much.
The pendulum swung the other way, didn't it, in that instance? Okay, but here's an interesting point, and Corinne, I want to lead this into you because Peter, you raised a couple of interesting points. One of the things that reminded me, by the way, just to digress, is I remember one of the United States' largest technical retailers introduced a vendor rationalization strategy because they said they couldn't manage all of the suppliers. They compressed it down to 100 vendors. And after a couple of years, they called in and said, okay, can we do an assessment? Because we had a big saving by dealing with, fewer vendors, less costs for managing the process, greater volume discount. But what they found a few years later when they did an assessment is that because they limited their scope of experience to only 100 suppliers, the market did what we were talking about. It changes. And what ended up happening is what was big savings for the first couple of years ended up meaning that they were paying 20 to 30% above the going market rate because they didn't expand to new suppliers. So you've got that pressure point of managing the smaller suppliers, trying to say, are the systems and the technology in place to do that? Do we have to rationalize, or how do we tap into this big market but do it on a quality effective basis? And that's one of the things that I think is interesting, because price volatility is always going to be a reality. And leading that, Corinne, and my point here is, isn't that where the adaptability and the agility to work with suppliers, regardless of size, and collaborate together, isn't that going to be critical? Especially now that you're looking at such great emphasis on DE&I, diversity in the supply base, and ESG. I mean, these are triggers that are now saying, look, price volatility is going to be real. We have to be able to have a supply chain that's resilient, that's agile, and able to respond. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think agility and flexibility is going to be important going forward. And I think a lot of the suppliers, at least the ones that we talk to, are happy to operate in that kind of environment, as long as, again, there's a clear understanding of what the rules of the game are, right? And understanding that the free market, they're going to go with whoever is most able to provide the product at the right time and at the right price. And I think, a lot of smaller companies are willing to sort of play in that game and be flexible and agile and be innovative. And the nice thing about many of them is that they can sometimes more quickly respond to changes that may be coming from those larger buyers. So I think that it would be absolutely something that a lot of smaller suppliers would be very open to being a part of, right? Because one, it may give them more opportunity, and two, it also forces them to be more innovative. But again, it has to be in an environment where they feel like they're going to be
okay. So Reka, I want to go to you, and I want to point out with 3 different levels here in this question. Is they're talking about a single data layer where your internal teams and suppliers are working from the same complete and accurate data, regardless of the software system they're using. experience layer. They talk about large organizations having multiple systems to manage, legacy systems, etc. And so their internal procurement teams should have, instead of a multiple of complexity systems to navigate, have a single intelligent experience supplier portal. That's what they're talking about. And then the integrated layer is that, the supplier experience is able to be measured and quantified, not just from a procurement department standpoint, but the impact across the whole enterprise. I mean, if you get the supplier, if you get the buyer with the right mindset, who's accepting, we've got diversity now, we've got ESG, we realize and accept because of the crisis that, we need to engage more suppliers on a quality basis. I mean, does it then shift to becoming a technology issue? And when I say a technology issue, are there the tools available to do a single intelligent experience supplier portal? Are there the tools available to access and share data if that trust environment has been built up? How do you deal with that?
Well, principle number one, obviously never invest in technology for technology's sake. So be very clear about what this technology is there to serve. It's a means to an end. I'm sure Eloise Epstein, your friend, will have some strong views on the market and the possibilities. Now, Eloise is obviously a visionary. She hasn't probably worked out all the details around how this can be done. I think it's a journey, but I think her vision around the HubSpot concept is a very good one, because these three imperatives that she's talking about. Orchestrate procurement as an operation, start devolve procurement responsibilities into the enterprise, and provide access to tools with some sort of essential governance. Requires, it's complex, but it requires some of these hub capabilities that you outlined here, John. And you need to have a single interface for buyers, for stakeholders, for suppliers. You need to be able to connect the data from suppliers and the procurement data you have, because that's going to help you to integrate the different solutions within your landscape and get a cockpit centralized view on data, which means that it's accessible and you can start acting on it. Is it realistic? Absolutely. But is it an evolution? Yes, it is as well. And I think the biggest barrier at the moment is, a lot of the existing legacy systems that are already in place, that companies have invested a lot of money in and try to influence in the right direction, but where a lot of companies are moving into a new way of thinking. But you have to kind of pay down a lot of that debt that you have built up. And then I think you need to look at your skill sets and how you structure people differently. Data scientists, the data analyst, you need proper change agents. You need much more involvement from enterprise architecture, and you need to really consider all the enterprise stakeholders, both from a data perspective and from a workflow and I suppose usage perspective as well. So these are massive transformations. It's not done overnight, but it's definitely possible. And I don't want to talk too much about what we do necessarily here, but we are proving that this is absolutely possible to centralize the data, to create a single interface, to connect the systems, and to start orchestrate and
all
make
right, so
life
here's,
easier
let's go
for
there.
the
I
supplier
think we're running close to our end of time, but I've got a couple of audience questions, advanced questions that came in. So here's what I want to do. I want to go around all three of you and about 30, 40 seconds. I've got a couple of questions that need answering. And Peter, I want to ask you from the standpoint of the buyer perspective, Corinne from the supplier perspective, and then Ragnar from the technology perspective. One of the questions is, and we talked about the winning rivalry. Let's talk about it's cost focused, lowest price, the Walmart model versus a more collaborative and transparent model. Peter, how do buyers organizations make that transition? Are they now ready to do that? Is that the critical starting point?
Oh gosh, we haven't got long. I think the first question is organizations have to think whether they want to make that transition, because I do think there's a question of appropriateness, and different organizations, different spend categories, different requirements need different approaches. And we said you can't have a intense collaborative relationship with every single supplier, and there'll be things you buy where a Darwinian approach might be the absolutely right thing to do. So I think understanding your strategy, and it's got to have a good fit with the organizational overall strategy, the organization culture, and it's probably got to be category specific. And then you pick some targets, category targets or supplier targets, where you think there's something to be gained by taking a more collaborative approach, and you.
Okay, let's go to
You
Corinne.
start a program.
I think it's very interesting. Corinne, from the supplier side of the standpoint, how do suppliers, especially again considering the demographics of the 95,000 you represent, small businesses, how do they identify those markets? What role do they have to be able to identify those opportunities that are giving them the best likelihood of full collaboration or collaboration, transparency, and an opportunity, of course, obviously, generate revenue?
Yeah, I mean, I think for them, it's a matter of working with buyers that are willing to listen to their approaches and the way that they may want to do things. For example, if they have ideas on how potentially they could supply something a little bit different that could be equally effective for that particular buyer, that they're being listened to. And I think sometimes that isn't necessarily happening to the same degree. But I think conversely, it's also feeling like when there is an issue that comes up that could potentially be a friction point, that there's an ability for them to talk to somebody about it, right? And that isn't always the case when it's through a technology portal or some other thing that makes it more difficult for them to be able to interact. So I think that the more buyers that look at a collaborative model, I understand what Peter's saying, that in some instances a Darwinian approach is still going to be the most effective for the buyer. But from a supplier perspective, that collaborative approach is going to probably create more again, loyalty with that particular supplier. So I think.
All right, so I want to go to you now, Ragnar, because
try
you
to
have
do as much of that
broader experience. I'm narrowing down the scope, but the technology emerging. Is it almost like being dressed up with nowhere to go with today's technology? And Peter, you and I know the history of the trouble and struggles organizations had with big ERP implementations, etc. Yet the Deloitte survey came out saying in 2019, saying that the majority of procurement or CPOs on their global survey were dissatisfied with the results of their digital transformation. And knowing what technology was and the progress that's been made, Ragnar, I mean, it's not really a technology limitation anymore. I mean, is technology often on the sidelines here? Your role then becomes one of not so much the technology, but educating what Peter's talking about, creating the will and the understanding where it does work and where the Darwinian should be applied. And or as Corinne said, that collaboration. I mean, is that all part of now the way people think of procurement now catching up to taking full advantage of the emerging technology? You know what I'm saying?
Kind of. I think we see every approach here. We see digital laggards who's buying for the wrong reasons. We see digital fashionistas who's trying to show, maturity that they don't have. You have conservatives who's being very careful about investing, and you have certain leaders who's doing for the right reasons and getting the value. Now, I love the perspective when I moved from Delphi CRM 18 years ago into Salesforce, and how delightful that experience was. But of course, Salesforce had a huge amount of limitations. Today, when I'm using Salesforce, we are integrating, even us as a small company, with probably 15 other applications to gather data, to extract customer intelligence, to interact with the client. But we are using Salesforce as pretty much as a front end. We as workers, the equivalent to buyers. And I think there is a lot of so the technologies there are able to do it, but you have to do it with the right purpose. And then there's a huge amount of change in procurement and in stakeholder management and managing that change, and the capabilities that underpins the ability to manage that change that has to happen alongside with it. There are plenty of examples of failed technology implementations, and that will probably continue, but we are learning gradually, companies, and it's moving in the right direction. I personally think one of the big things that are holding us back, and I'll be brief here, is the KPIs of the function. We need to flex up our KPIs. I think that allows us to track the value differently and start getting stakeholders better on board and build a different mandate for procurement, a mandate that drives procurement priorities in line with what the business needs the priorities to be, rather than just focusing on cost, which is this lag that I'm referring to. And until that happens, I think there will still be a bit of a lag in picking up even bigger pace.
Well, it's interesting, and I'm going to go to Peter. We got one more question. Hopefully, Duncan, we have a couple more minutes, because I think it builds on what Ragnar said. You talk about KPIs. Peter, when I look at you, one of the questions that came from the audience is, what metrics do you use to measure success under a collaborative model? And how long does it usually take to start seeing results? From a buying standpoint or a buyer standpoint, I mean, outside of the traditional measurements of cost savings, I mean, how do you measure success in a collaborative model? How do you measure the outcome?
Well, I think you can have some sort of measure around, how many suppliers, or maybe even what proportion of spend is covered by some sort of collaboration innovation program. That's not really getting necessarily at outcomes and outputs, but at least it's saying, we're now engaged with 30 suppliers in a proper collaborative program. And I've had measures like that even back in my CPO days. You can try and measure outcomes from that. So the example Ragnar gave about what proportion of new product ideas or new developments, packaging technologies, whatever, what proportion of those are coming from suppliers? That's a good measure. Or you can do supplier surveys. And that's another topic in itself, but I've used that in the past. It was a real eye-opener, actually, the first time I did it, finding out what your suppliers really think of you. Corinne will know about that. But, what rating would your suppliers give you as a customer? Marks out of 10, or what's it called, net promoter score?
Interesting. Now it's created, and I see, Duncan, you're going to rush us along. Can I have one more minute there? Because the survey that you took asked that very question of suppliers in the large thing. So the results will be very interesting. Corinne, from a supplier standpoint, from somebody providing a buyer, I mean, how do they measure success? What is their framework for saying, this is an organization who I want to deal with, this is an organization who I wouldn't go near with a 10-foot pole?
Likely it's going to be around the stress levels of the particular business, and how much do you actually have extra time and effort do you have to put in to make sure that the collaboration is working the way it should be? Are you able to feel like the agreement that you've come to is being abided by, and you can just provide the supply or the services or the products that particular buyer is looking for, without having to sort of follow up and do other extra work in order to make sure that things are happening appropriately? So I think, frankly, it's probably just around.
All right. And Ragnar, I'm going to go to you to close it all off from this, because again, I'm going to highlight that survey that's going to be coming out. I mean, it's the communication with the suppliers, obviously, that is the most important in your motivation for doing this, wasn't it?
Communication, to some degree, I think, bad communication is part of the friction points that we've seen. But I really think that the picture you're building here, Corinne, this is fact. This is real. And if you look at the supplier hierarchy of needs, they don't care about collaboration. They don't even care whether they're important. What they care about is their first need, which is ethical, fairness, efficient, transparent. And that's why we think this is what has to be fixed first. And consistently, this is also coming up in our own survey results. This has consistently come up in our supplier experience community. The top 3 there, by the way, was getting paid on time, getting visibility on payment, and consistency around, that invoice. It's not going to change, efficient onboarding, easy access to maintain your data, much better communication. So for instance, in our own survey, most companies, 2/3 say they're not set up to do the best work for their customers. About half of them, find it really difficult to resolve inquiries if they have a challenge. Just picking up the phone, you don't even know who to support. There's a lot of left hand, right hand confusion and schizophrenia within enterprises, and it's really hard to solve that. And this notion of portal fatigue is joining as well. Maybe less so in retail, perhaps, but for a lot of other organizations, they have multiple relationships with their enterprises. A lot of new initiatives. They're expected to use a lot of different technologies. That experience have not been really considered. So lots and lots of friction points.
Duncan, listen, I think we ran a little overtime here, but I think it's safe to assume we're now at least trying to move away from you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. Cards goes to the best relationships, and we're moving to leverage the technologies that are available to be able to bring supplier intelligence there. So I'll turn it back over to you. Again, Peter, Corinne, and Ragnar, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this time talking with you. And Duncan, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'll be super quick on the sign-off. As I mentioned, stick around after the live event. You will get links to our conversation and content portal. So if you want to carry on the discussion, you can do that, or just use the hashtag suppliers perspective, all one word, across any platform, and we'll pick up on that dialogue. But all that remains for me to say is thank you very much to everybody. Have a great rest of the day, and speak to you all again soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.